Welcome back. Here in this same session, now that you've been introduced to Virgil and Aeneid, we would like to provide some additional background on Roman epic before, in the next session, we turn to Ovid and the Metamorphoses. Some of this, you may remember, came up when we did the previous videos on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where we did in fact introduce epic more fully there. So now we're going to be reintroducing epic here, but now put into the Roman context of how they composed it over their relatively brief period for the composition of their literature. I'd like you to pause your video and please recheck on Sakai that you have your calendar open to the session for chapter 19 and Virgil, because after the outline of pertaining to Virgil, there's an additional outline down below that gives you information on Roman epic, and you can use that to follow along what I describe here. So please pause your video and open the calendar to the session on chapter 19 and Roman epic. Okay, do you have that open? Excellent. Okay, so epic, as you remember in the previous videos on Homer, is the form of poetry that is composed in dactylic hexameter. It's a meter that goes like this. And you can also make it spondaic, much longer, like bum, 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 bum. However you decide to do it. So the same rules for the meter, with a few variants for Latin versus Greek, apply to Roman epic as do for Greek. And as is the case with Greek epic, Roman epic is defined narrowly, not just simply by the meter, but also by the content. So remember with the Greek works that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were epic because the subject matter was great heroes, kings, and events. Whereas Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days were not technically epic because although they were written in the same meter, they were didactic, meaning that they were offering instruction. So in like manner, this work by Lucretius, the one called De Rerum Natura, technically wouldn't be an epic in that sense because that again is philosophical and didactic, but Virgil's Aeneid is epic, and for the next session, Ovid's Metamorphoses also would be considered epic with the correct meter and also the correct content of gods, heroes, kings, and great events. Okay, so with bearing that all in mind, we're going to put in context now the history of Roman literature as it pertains to the Roman Republic and Empire. So you could see how we come to a big peak in Roman literature with Virgil's Aeneid. Okay, so the first date that is given to us, not canonical, but actually a real date that is accepted by scholars for which we have evidence from ancient Roman authors, including most notably Cicero, is 240 BC. That same date that Cicero mentions is also picked up by the later literary critic Quintilian, and we're quite sure that this is accurate. So 240 BC would be in the so-called Middle Republic period when the Romans were expanding militarily, and in particular when they were fighting the three Punic Wars with Carthage as they came in contact with the outside world around Italy, and in some cases ran into some opposition and ultimately some causes for conflict. So 240 BC is the year in which the author Livius Andronicus published his first play in Rome. And this play was based on one of the Greek Hellenistic models. In the separate course, Classics 391, shameless plug, Greek ancient laughter, Greek and Roman comedy. We talk about the Greek playwright Menander, who was one of the earliest playwrights in the Hellenistic period after 322 BC. He wrote a Greek new comedy, so-called, which was then picked up as a model for later Roman playwrights like Plautus and Terence to write their own plays. So in this period, from 240 BC on, is when the Romans are doing this. And this is in fact the earliest period of Roman literature that we have. And prior to 240 BC, there isn't any Roman literature of note. The Romans don't appear to have recorded anything such that we could be aware of. So this is the first date when something emerges. from Rome. And that's quite surprising considering that the canonical date for the foundation of Rome is 753 BC. It takes 5 centuries, thereabouts, for the Romans to produce anything of note in literature. Longer than that if you consider that Rome probably did exist in some form prior to that date of 753 BC. Okay, so 240 BC is your date for the first literary input from Rome. We do have a couple of examples of epic prior to these authors in that tender period right after 240 BC. Livius Andronicus himself, in fact, wrote an epic poem that was a translation of Homer's Odyssey, and his successor, Gnaeus Naevius, also wrote an epic poem that was called Bellum Poenicum, that was all about the 3 Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. However, although they were epic in content, they were not technically epic in meter because they did not use the hexameter meter, the one that I just described a little bit. They used a different older meter called the Saturnine meter, which was in fact a relatively complicated local meter that the Romans picked up in their first efforts to compose epic poetry. And it was a very awkward, cumbersome one to use, and it didn't work well with the Latin language. Nonetheless, it was quite impressive that these 2 early authors, Livius Andronicus and Gnaeus Naevius, were going to this effort to even attempt to compose epic poetry in these early days without the benefit of the hexameter. The one who actually really did put the hexameter in the forefront was this author, Quintus Ennius, who lived from 239 to 169 BC. It was he who really did it at the forefront. Sadly, his works have all perished, except for some fragments. From the impression that we have from the fragments, it doesn't seem that the composition was especially skillful, especially the epic that he wrote. Nonetheless, though, once again, he is considered to be the pioneer of many forms of Roman literature, tragedies and comedies, and satires, which are described here as also epic. So he really did it all. And without him, these genres would not have existed for the later authors, even though his own skill at actually composing wasn't necessarily the best. In the case of epic, what he wrote was an historical work called Annales. And it's kind of a predecessor to what Livy eventually did in real history, plus some other historians in between, whose works are now lost to us. But Ennius was a poem on Roman history that was so-called Annales because it went year by year, analytically, from the foundation of Rome down to his own time. And this was, in fact, the first effort of any Greek author to write in the hexameter epic and to do it reasonably successfully. Now, a little bit later than that, though, and in fact, Quintus also started this matter off as well, Ennius did, another genre cropped up that also used the same hexameter meter, and that was satire, or satira in Latin, which is a little bit different from the way we think of satire today, like political satire. Satire is a hexameter poem that could be on any other topic it wants to be other than an epic topic or a didactic topic. It could be anything that the guy wants to talk about. So it's kind of like a blog almost. And essentially, the satire was one of the most conversational and thereby informal forms of literature that the Romans had. And although there is satiric poetry in existence in the Greek world, with, for instance, the lyric poetry of Archilochus, and of course, the really wonderful political satire of Aristophanes, satire as a genre is reasonably correctly stated by the critic Quintilian as really one of Roman's own creations. There really is nothing precisely like satire, especially in the epic form in the Greek world. And so Ennius was the first one also to write satires. However, the real father of satire was this guy, Gaius Lucilius, from 180 to 103 BC. He was the one who devoted his literary efforts to satire and really got it going. Be aware, therefore, that satire, again, is not epic, even though it's in the same meter, because it's not describing the same particular topic as epic, the elevated topic. So Gnaeus Lucilius advanced Roman literature further with satires, following the lead of Ennius. And then as far as didactic poetry goes, we have, again, Titus Lucretius, the one who wrote De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, in which he espouses Epicurean philosophy. So this is the tradition of epic poetry as Virgil finally picks it up. And Virgil, having seen previous models for how epic was to be composed, was able to study their models together with those of Homer, with the excellent education that he luckily received in Rome and in Greece. And he finally really mastered the art of didactic poetry and epic poetry altogether. And he also was able successfully to show the mythic history of Aeneas, the founder of the colony at the Tiber River, that demonstrated the fate, the divine destiny that lay in back of the eventual creation of the city of Rome that would itself become this really strong mega power all through the Mediterranean world, controlling this mighty empire. So Virgil was able to do for Augustus proud and the Romans proud by finally being able to historicize the creation of the Roman Empire in a work of literature that really emulated the Greeks wonderfully and may, in some ways, even have surpassed the Greeks in talent for its Roman identity. Okay, so I hope that this has given you a good understanding of the background of Roman epic as it pertains to Virgil's Aeneid. And that concludes the videos for this session. And in the next session, we'll be taking up Ovid and his work, the Metamorphoses. So we'll see you next session and next video.